Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you happen to be in the world. My name's David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre. Before we begin, may I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Sydney is now based. These lands were never ceded nor purchased from their rightful owners, who have the right of access to land, water, and air. We recognise their traditional owners past, present, and emerging. I'm going to hand over in a minute to Fiona Gill, who's the head of sociology here. And before I do that, though, can I remind you that after Professor Gearher has spoken, there will be a question and opportunities for questions and answers and discussion. And if you wish to raise a topic, please use the Q&A question and answer function at the bottom of the Zoom page. Right, now over to Fiona, and I'm going to sit back and listen to a great presentation.
Thank you, David, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to see so many people here, and welcome particularly to our honoured guest speaker, Professor Gearher, who is going to be giving a really, I think, fascinating account of some research that has been going on for several years and really begins to talk about some very, very interesting international comparisons, which I don't think have been done before. So I'm really looking forward to hearing this. So as David said, there will be a really interesting talk and then there will be a Q&A session immediately afterwards. So we'll just ask people pop their questions into the chat. And then we can have a sort of more general conversation. But Jill, if you would like to take over, I'm going to pass you over and we can start the main event.
Thank you, David and Fiona, for having me this morning in Paris, where I'm talking from. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I'm going to share my screen. Here it comes. I don't need this. Oh, okay. Is it fine like this?
Yes, we can see the screen. Not a problem. So that's fine. So we've got the title slide up. Yes.
Yeah, like this. That's even better.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm presenting this evening is actually the results of a collective project that was conducted over the last 5 years, funded by the French National Research Agency. We were a group of 10 scholars, both historians and sociologists, working on 3 different countries, China, France, and Japan. And what I'm presenting is the book to be published by Amsterdam University Press by the end of this year or the beginning of next year, co-edited by Bernard Thoman, a historian of Japan, and a social historian of Japan, and myself. What we're doing in this book is analyzing the working class condition and insecure labor in times of economic prosperity. So the aim of the program was to analyze the links between high economic growth on one side and the transformation of work and labor insecurity on another one, in 3 different contexts: China, France, Japan, at 2 different times. The 3-decade-long post-war boom in France and Japan from the 1950s to the 1970s, and the 1980s onwards in China. So the project, which therefore is comparative, both in terms of geography, 3 countries, and times, 2 different periods of time. The main question raised is, what does job insecurity look like in a period of high economic growth, and how the different parties, workers, unions, state institutions, business representatives, influence the regulations aiming at protecting workers? I'll go back to that issue. The aim of the book is to address the social repercussions of high economic growth in order to present a new and less monolithic and less glorious vision of actually the post-war economic boom, and drawing parallels with the complexity of the Chinese situation. So the idea is to propose a better understanding of what a capitalist economy is. the question raised is not the issue of the convergence of China with the trajectories of mature capitalist economies, but oppositely, we are using the Chinese case to reassess what has happened in France and Japan. So it's like the idea was to start to look at France and Japan from China. And we argue that the construction of a wage society in France and Japan did not mean a standardization of salaried work and a rise in job insecurity for all, nor did it bring about the virtual disappearance of precarity. The project dialogue with at least two types of academic literature. First, the literature on decommodification of work and the development of social policies, followed by the de-standardization of labor. We're referring here to the large literature on the economic boom experienced in France and Japan starting in the 1950s, that has enhanced career security, led to institutionalized mechanisms for collective bargaining and more universal systems of social security. This was the period of the construction of both a wage earning society and a welfare state protecting employees. For all the differences, the post-war welfare states represent the culmination of a relative decommodification of work and through the development of social policies. The French expression, les 30 glorieuses, or the 30 glorious years, coined by an economist in 1979, sums up the positive assessment of this period. The widely held view of these years as synonymous with a general rise in job security has been further reinforced by the fact that the accumulation regime underpinning them is today considered to be in crisis. Ulrich Beck, for instance, has argued that full employment and standardized forms of work have given way to, I quote, a destandardization of labor, while Robert Castel has highlighted an erosion of the social protection achieved at the height of the wage labor society, a process of, I quote, disaffiliation. In contrast to the accounts of post-war prosperity in France and Japan, earlier research on the consequences of China's rapidly expanding economy initially focused on the dismantling of the Danwei system, the life employment in work units, and then shifted to the emergence of a new working class, mainly composed of rural migrants and subjected to specific forms of exploitation. After more than 4 decades of reform, China's working class is still very much fragmented. Some workers enjoy full-time contracts, others are employed on a part-time or temporary basis. Others still have no contract and are paid by the task, particularly in the service sector where most new jobs are created. And that's why we start from the fragmentation of the Chinese working class, looking back at Japan and France. Another literature we're dialoguing with is the academic literature on precarity. There is a lively debate among scholars on precarious work and precarization in the history of industrial capitalism. A growing literature generally based on the case of mature capitalist economies argue that precariousness is a new phenomenon, and here referring to Guy Standing Precaria 2014. But historians, and notably Marcel van der Linden, has shown that this is not the case, that precaria has existed for many years and used to be called casual poor. Earlier on in Europe, some workers were not members of guilds or tied to landowners and were then marginalized. It was only after the Second World War that a large proportion of wage earners in industrial countries enjoyed standard employment relationships. However, they were mainly men. A feature of this literature is the lack of non-European centered studies on precariousness. And I guess the originality of our approach is that it starts from the case of China in a situation of high economic growth. And as other authors, we argue that standard, stable employment under capitalist condition is actually a historical exception. We're well aware that we are actually comparing the incomparable. The comparison is ambitious in both it is transcultural and intertemporal. We're talking about different political contexts. Of course, France and Japan in the post-war decades boasted democratic institutions, had a lively political life punctuated by elections, mobilizing citizens and parties. And the 50s and 60s were also a time of intense social unrest. Labor mobilizations gave rise to large-scale industrial action in which the unions played a major role. Comparatively, of course, the Chinese Communist Party continues to monopolize political power, and China has just one union that reports directly to the CCP and does not defend workers' rights locally. Social mobilization in China is closely monitored, and when it does occur, is highly restricted. The geopolitical landscape of the two periods is also very different. One was marked by the Cold War and American efforts to secure France and Japan in the Western camp. The other period we're considering has seen global capitalism triumph along with an unprecedented circulation of goods and capital, foreign investors playing a major role in China's economic growth. Despite these different contexts, we argue that comparison is still possible. And I'll give you two examples. One example is the issue of migrations. Economic growth in China has meant the virtual disappearance of the old working class, the former masters of the state, replaced by a new class of rural migrant workers exploitable at will. This reality of internal migration as a pillar of economic growth is, to our understanding, comparable with the continued rural exodus, for instance, in France. Part of the French working class retained strong links with its rural origins, and the mobilization of foreign workers from North Africa that was very much orchestrated by the French state itself. In Japan, internal migration also helped drive economic prosperity, and the government helped organize the mass migration of young rural Japanese to understaffed urban industries. Another example of a common feature in these three different contexts is the fact that in these three countries, there are production-oriented models that give the state a central role in both economic and social regulations. And I'll mention the example of the minimum wage policy that has been implemented in the three countries. So in the three contexts, we see the development within the state of an entire sphere of biopolitics aims at balancing the imperatives of production and reproduction. We also refuse to see countries, of course, as mutually impermeable blocks. Adopting the idea of an entangled history, we seek to underline the connections rather than the differences between social spaces and historical forms. Our analysis is mostly a micro and qualitative analysis. We have used different kinds of sources, interviews with former workers, in the case of France and Japan, retired workers, union activists, human resources managers. We have made use of narratives, sometimes published narratives of workers, including the autobiographies, website testimonies, in the case of China, in blogs. And we have collected documents from personal and company archives, like hiring forms, payslips, dismissal letters, personal files in company archives, pension claims detailing workers' employment history, official reports linked to occupational health lawsuits. These various documents enabled us to conduct a mostly micro analysis of the strategies pursued by the stakeholders, working class individuals, households, labor unions representatives, or state representatives. I'll first give an outline of the book before going back in more details on the chapter 2, which is here on that slide in red color. The 5 chapters are not simply a succession of national case studies. because unlike many other comparative studies, our aim was not to construct national ideal types. Instead, we proposed thematic analysis, blending in-depth micro-perspective based on extensive fieldwork. Each chapter was written by 2 or 3 authors using data gathered by the entire team. So the writing process was quite interesting and exciting because the entire members of the project were bringing their data, and some of us were using them to write the different chapters. We start the book with a chapter on payslips, payslip being like the most concrete material that embodies the relationship between the company and its employees. We underline the diversity of forms of the payslips. Of course, formats found during the study were diverse, depending on national context, depending on time, but formats also varied between companies. At the very same time, in one country, there were different formats of payslips from one company to another, which seems to show that there was not really a national norm, and that the form depended on the company. Using the payslip, we of course can also read the development of the welfare state over the decades and policies regulating income. These policies added new categories of payslips and actually created new complexity when it came to understanding them. On payslips, you can read you can see the emergence of family benefits, social assistance, and in a sense, governmental regulations aiming to reduce economic insecurity. Payslips also reveal the gap between a more secure workforce and a precarious workforce left behind by modernization measures. In fact, during the post-war period, some non-regular employees, day laborers or temporary workers, and employees of small and medium-sized enterprises received either no payslips or much less detailed one. And this absence of wage documentation for those workers in the most precarious conditions is, of course, a characteristic feature of the Chinese context. So the second chapter on which I will give a more extensive presentation is dealing with a working class household economy and how salaries were used in the domestic sphere. The aim being to explore the practices and strategy when it comes to spending employed by workers and their families. In the third chapter, we study labor movements, demands, exploring how workers and their representatives drew public attention to their cause. Despite strong differences in civil, political, and social citizenships, as I mentioned earlier, between France, Japan, and China, we try to identify patterns. We are talking in the chapter both of conventional forms of demands and more alternative forms. When I mean conventional forms, I'm referring mostly to strikes, and we are also paying close attention to minor strikes in France and Japan in the 1960s that at the time contradict the narrative of the inexorable disappearance of the proletarian class. And that notably in 1960 in France, 1963 in France, 1960 in Japan, miners were protesting against worsening working conditions. Of course, the comparison with China is trickier because of the very different context. However, even in the mining industry, you can identify a similar context of declining working conditions and rising accidents. As in the two other countries, workers in China feel that they are being left behind the rest of the urban population, experiencing a rapid improvement in living standards. And in China as well, protest is used to affirm their interest. We're also paying attention to alternative forms of expression, and is notably looking at how workers or workers' unions or workers' associations were making use of art and literature to express their demands. Chapter 4 searches to understand how the notion of precarity was embodied in negotiating arenas. We try to understand how the demands of groups, individuals concerning situations of precarity were handled by the players involved, labor unions, employers' representatives, and also the state, who played a major role. In the case of China, high growth has arisen in a context where the free organization of employees remains limited and where the only unions to be recognized are official and with state-controlled unions without autonomy. Nevertheless, the Chinese state was forced to tackle the question of constructing mechanisms for social regulation of the economy. And we argue that the introduction of the minimum wage via two laws in 1993 and then in 2004, along with the debates about its merits, is a clear example of how the Chinese state is actually sensitive to the issue of workers' conditions. The book ends with a chapter on religion and ethics in the business world. In times of prosperity, one might imagine business leaders to focus solely on exploiting the new economic context and to show indifference to social issues, unemployment, and precarity. In reality, managers in different national contexts have addressed the question of business ethics, often linked to religious beliefs, and this is a topic of the chapter 5. We observe how employers and businesses dealt with social issues by using a religious discourse. Catholic and Protestant religions in France, Buddhism in Japan, Confucian heritage in China, referring in China to the Wushang movement. So this chapter dialogue with the scholarship on business ethics and ethical capitalism, looking at how business leaders question their place in society and seek to reconcile faith and religion practice with their business activities. And now I turn to a more detailed presentation of the chapter 2 on consumption behaviors of the working class. The starting point of the chapter is that in the three countries and two different contexts, historical contexts, entered a new consumption regime characterized by an increase of income, the development of the welfare state, and an increase of the share of social benefits that make up household income, and which has contributed to reduction of inequalities. Widespread access to credit was also part of this new regime of consumption. The expansion of consumption was also made possible by the standardization of products, mass production, and lower prices. What the chapter shows is, in fact, that workers remained at the margin of the emerging consumption society, and also the great heterogeneity of the working class. Not all workers changed their consumption regime at the same pace or according to the same schedule. In addition to the sector of activity, we must take into account the type of job held, the worker's gender, his or her marital and family situation, his or her migration trajectory. This is a chapter that is based on ethnographic data gathered in the various fields of investigation in the three countries. The chapter starts with consideration of wages increase in a context of economic growth. We first state macroeconomic data showing this rapid wage increase. In France, for instance, between 1949 and 1976, nominal wages grew at an unprecedented rate of almost 5% per year, without any cyclical downturn. In Japan, between 1956 and 1973, nominal wages of young people entering the labor market grew at an average of 11.5% per year. In the case of China, the growth rates are also very impressive. Annual wage growth among urban residents is around 10% between 1988 and 1995, and 8% again, 8% between 1995 and 2013. Behind, and now what we want to look at is what it means behind for a worker's households. Of course, and you see here figures and charts representing the growth of income of 3 workers in France, Japan, and in China. The general trend show, of course, an overall increase in salary throughout their careers. However, there are also, if you look at in details of on each individuals, you see that there are times where their wage drop or stagnate, which can be explained by the working environment or changes in employment relationship. If you look at the chart on the left of a French hosiery worker in the 1960s and 70s, you see that there are several drops. One is in 1964 and 65, due to 2 pregnancies of this woman worker. She took 2-3 months periods of unpaid leave. Then from 1965 to 1968, she worked from home on a flat salary. In fact, her employer forced women at the time, women with young kids, to accept flat rate wage, that was actually much lower than what they would have earned on a piecework basis in the factory. The reason being that they were considered as less profitable during that period and could not maintain a very high level of productivity. Between 68 and 77, the same female worker continued to work from home and was paid on a piecework basis. In 1971, she was temporarily laid off because of downturn cycle. And of course, home-based workers were the first to be laid off when the company was going through a downturn cycle. And then she was rehired by the factory. It's only during the last 20 years of her working life that she experienced a continuous growth in her salary. If you look at the case of the Japanese worker, minor worker on the right hand of the slide, of course, you see a general increase in her monthly salary. But as the graph shows, the overall increase is very irregular from 1 month to the next, sometimes with a significant decrease in a particular month. These variations can be explained by the fact that the salary was paid monthly, but it actually was calculated in large part on a daily basis. It changed every day according to production. In some months, the number of days worked was lower due to the company initiated reduction of production, or also because of illness, or even fatigue and reluctance of the worker to go down the pit following an accident at the colleague's work site. Reversely, in some months also involved more overtime and night work than others. Of course, the introduction of a minimum wage in France, minimum wage was introduced in 1950, in Japan in 1959, and as I said earlier, in China in 1993. And then the shift to a monthly payment of wages contributed to the regularity of workers' incomes from month to month. But as I underlined, the shift from piecework to flat wages was seen, that can be seen as a progress, could actually lead to a drop of income if the worker could not compensate by working longer hours, a variable over which he had no control because it was the boss who decided the working hours. Next, we talk about the conception of working class households. Admittedly, situations varied depending on the period in question and the type of company. In Japan, both large and small mining companies set themselves apart, whereas in China, workers who have a formal employment contract and who worked for large firms are the ones receiving a regular income. Looking into details, we also show that actually situations vary within one company, because income varies from one worker to another, from one post to another. And within a company, some employees are paid on piecework basis, while others are paid by the hour. The amount a worker receives in wages actually depend on a wide variety of factors: the quantity produced, the remuneration paid per piece, bonuses linked to performance, seniority, attendance, meaning continuous attendance on the job, the amount of overtime work, depending on fluctuations in orders, a specific remuneration for working teams, and finally, individual or collective pay rises. If we look at individual situations in terms of expenses, situations vary depending on the household, which must therefore be taken into account. And here we have the case of two Chinese workers. On the left side, this is a worker who is 30 years old in September 2017, married with two years old twins. His wife having stopped working when the children were born. This worker is a local worker, not a migrant worker. He was born in the city where the interview took place. He owned his home and has never taken out a loan, thanks to the financial support of his parents, who actually bought not only the apartment he now lives in, but also his car. You can see that the greatest item of the household expenditure, 44%, stems from taking care of the two very young children. On the right side, you have the case on another worker who earns more or less the same amount, the exact amount of income. He's slightly older, he's 32 years old. He's a migrant worker from a poor neighborhood in Anhui province. His wife and his two daughters, aged 10 and 3, have remained in his own village, a situation he considered temporary. And as you can see, he has a very tight control over all his expenditure. And contrary to the first one, his employer provides free accommodation in the factory dormitory. So here you see that his saving rate is 40%, whereas in the case of the first worker, saving rate is only less than 20%. In the case of China, but we show that it's also the case in France in the 1950s, for instance. The cost of raising children, educating them, funding their marital plans is a very strong constraint. And there are major differences in behavior between the minority of urban workers, local workers, and the majority of migrant workers coming from poor rural areas, who often have to pay the cost associated with relocating to the city, while at the same time supporting their parents and children back home in the countryside. Despite their modest financial incomes, there are other resources available for working class households to help them make ends meet on a daily basis. First, there is a consumption paid by the company very established feature of the Chinese case, where workers live in factory dormitories. But this was very common in France and Japan, notably in the mining industry. Another option is having an extra job, which is quite common in the French case, but long working hours in China make it almost impossible. The use of loans in all interviews, we have many workers who have actually borrowed money, first from relatives, but also from banking institutions. And in the case of Japan, the money is also often lent to workers by their employers. All this to underline the fact that working class households count every penny in order to keep their expenditure under control and get by on a day-to-day basis. Here, the image is an extract from a book's recording a female French worker income with wages on one side and all the household expenses on the other side. What we try to show is also that workers, households, plan for the future. Accounting is not only a day-to-day or month-to-month activity, but despite low levels of income and the emphasis generally being on survival, working class households do sometimes make certain decisions to help to plan for the future. Income not only serves to meet a household need, but also has a role to play in the social relational system on which the household is part, as Vivian Zelizer has shown. Working class households are no exception to this and incorporate their financial income into networks of relationships between family members and friends. The most striking example of this are intergenerational transfers, which function both as a constraint when it comes to helping elderly parents, especially in the event of illness, and as an additional source of income when young unmarried children hand their first wages over to their parents. In the case of China, migrant working class living in cities but originally from the countryside has a social obligation to provide material support for their relatives back home in the countryside. We have seen the same pattern, for instance, in the case of France, where young people in the hosiery industry female workers started working at the age of 14 or 16 and would continue to live with their parents, who kept almost all the money they earned. Finally, we also look at savings. The most obvious way of planning for the future is to build savings. In China, it is common to first set aside money to deal with, I quote, unforeseen circumstances and emergencies that are typically related to healthcare, either for workers themselves or for their parents, children, or relatives. This were another unforeseen event that people tended to save for, owing to the significant expense of having to gather friends and relatives together for a banquet. Savings were also, of course, used to prepare for forcible expenses, such as a child's secondary or higher education, buy of property, the marriage of children, of course, one's own retirement. We end the chapter with underlining that actually workers' households are able to make compromises. There are types of trade-offs that households would make in order to cope with their precarity. Some of the female workers employed on a piecework basis preferred to earn less as not to wear themselves out at work. Working at a rapid pace all day long was so tiring that workers were unable to enjoy their free time, so maintaining an acceptable pace of work allowed them to maintain both a decent level of income and a decent state of health. We witnessed that in the French case, we witnessed that in China, when a potential trade-off for the working class was between formal and informal employment. The former, formal employment providing more or less a stable and regular income, but leaves the worker exposed to strong demands on the worker on the part of the employer. Informal work or informal employment allowed the worker to maintain both control of the working time and a sense of relative freedom. Concluding this chapter, we underline that rising incomes and an abundant supply of goods of consumption accompanied growth, but still working class households remained largely on the fringes of the developing consumer society and could only get by thanks to extremely disciplined spending. An analysis of household accounts showed that households used various types of calculation that took into account multiple forms of reciprocity, solidarity, constraints on the family as a whole, and wider peer support networks. But we also want to show that these calculations reveal that there were sometimes long-term trade-off possibilities, some even spanning a lifetime, meaning that working class populations were not the passive victims of exploitative economic institutions. They had at the same time a certain level of agency, limited by the power of employers who set up labor conditions and of course fixed wages and working hours. When it comes to the heterogeneity of the situations, those who are the most precarious are of course women, young women working as long as they were not married and had no children. But once the children are born, women will generally have a more flexible informal job or sometimes even work at home. Another category that was found to be particularly fragile was that of migrants, whose situation contrasted with that of local workers. Behind the rapid growth, there was indeed a myth of income and lifestyle homogenization that must be brought to light. I'll end my talk with first two conclusions, underlining the fact that this research is above all an approach of approaches precarity, observing it at the smallest possible scale, that of working individuals and households. So, I'm here defending a micro social perspective, because only a micro social perspective reveals the diversity, heterogeneity, inequality behind the general trends. What we have argued is that different employment forms with varying degrees of stability have coexisted at different time periods. And despite its specificities, the Chinese employment system is no exception. Not only does protected employment coexist with less stable forms of work, but actually individuals circulate between them depending on their stage in the life cycle or the growth of a particular sector. Second, final conclusion, a call for a comparative analysis from the point of view of a China scholar. I think, we should put an end to China exceptionalism and take China out of its epistemological isolation, as if, I think this is a point of view that is often defended by Chinese scholars, as if the Chinese experience was unique. We should analyze a China transformation in the light of other societies. I will end my talk with suggesting that you look at two other products of this program. There is here, I'm mentioning here, a special issue of a social history journal that is actually there is a fully English version of the issue. And here I'm mentioning an online exhibition where we are showing some of our data, and I'm giving a few exhibition. The online exhibition is organized along start with stories of workers and Japanese and French workers' stories. And then all the data, there are more than 100 types of documents that are gathered on this website. The data are either short films, interviews, images, private documents taken from workers' archives. And they are organized around three themes: lives, looking at the mobility of workers coming from the countryside and studying their biographical and professional journeys; bodies, he looked at the places of life that are also the places of control and surveillance, exploring suffering at work and health issues; and struggles, exploring the condition in which workers had acted to defend their interests, engaging in disputes, uniting to form association, and using creative arenas to make their voice heard. And you can also search the exhibition through maps. And here, if I click on the China map, you can select documents and by place. And for instance, here, I just show you the everyday life of a garment industry worker in Fuzhou. And here, yeah, there are a video extracted from a blog made by this garment worker. And I'll stop here, and looking forward to the discussion now.